Hello and welcome to this lecture on Washington after World War I. So in the previous lecture, we talked about the general American experience after World War I. And in general, Washingtonians experience many of the similar things. World War I results in widespread disillusionment. There were approximately 75,000 veterans of World War I from Washington State. And much like veterans across the country, they returned home after the war severely disillusioned. World War I was just a kind of war that had never been fought before. It's the first industrialized war in which industrial powers went to war with one another, in which industrial weapons were used against countries and armies that also possessed industrial weapons. And that resulted in death and destruction on a level that the world had never experienced, and that Western armies and Western individuals had never anticipated. There was also a general sense that the war was useless, that its war aims were not achieved, and there's just a general disillusionment that happens all throughout the Western world, but especially the United States. And keep in mind, the United States was only involved from a military perspective for a year in the war, and yet its soldiers came back that traumatized and disillusioned. You can only imagine what European countries experienced who've been involved in the war for several years before the United States got involved. But nonetheless, right, the war does change the spirit of the moment. That optimism that had defined the previous era, this idea that human beings were capable of solving problems, that the human spirit and ingenuity and intelligence that had created all this wonderful brand new technology and modernization could then be turned to solve social ills. There's just a tremendous pessimism for that after the war. There's really no appetite for reform. Um, and one of the things you see happen across the Western world, and this is especially true in the United States, is the political parties in charge during the war are then blamed for the war itself, right? So the Democratic Party, Wilson, who had been in charge during the war, is then the Democratic Party falls out of favor and begins to lose elections. They're blamed for the war itself. And since the Democratic Party under Wilson were the ones pushing most aggressively the reform movement, you can see where the 1920s would be a period antithetical to the reform movement, and the Republican Party takes over, as we talked about in the previous lecture, and it is the traditional wing of the Republican Party, the pro-business, pro-free markets wing of the party, not the Teddy Roosevelt wing of the party. And so there's this general disillusionment and pessimism that pervades the country, and Washington certainly experiences it. You can see it in some ways reflected in one of the most famous monuments that's erected in Washington after the war. So there was this wealthy businessman named Sam Hill. He's no blood relation to James J. Hill, even though he worked for the Great Northern Railroad, but he did marry one of James J. Hill's daughters, so he became an in-law, but his last name just happens to coincide with James J. Hill. But he's one of the wealthiest people in Washington, and he was a peace activist during the war, both before and after American involvement. And so he had never been a supporter of the war, but just seeing the war itself gave him such tremendous pessimism about humanity that he erected a monument. It wasn't the only monument he erected to the fallen soldiers of World War One. He erects two. One is the Peace Arch, which today is on the Canadian border between the United States and Canada. If you were to go north of Bellingham, it's not on the I-5 boundary. It's on the smaller road, which was the main entry point back then. But the Peace Arch is Sam Hill in stone grappling with the legacy of World War One. But a much more visceral World War One monument that he created is down on the Columbia River Gorge, south of Goldendale. And so Sam Hill had owned a large property down there called Maryhill. You can still tour his home today. He spent a lot of money building it. He never actually got to live in it fully finished, and he ultimately lost all his money. But Sam Hill was building this manor house based on European styles down there. And today it's a museum. And like I said, you can visit it. But a little bit east of his Maryhill Manor, on some of his land, he built a recreation of Stonehenge, and Stonehenge being the prehistoric monument on the Salisbury Plain in southern England. And he rebuilt this recreation of Stonehenge, but Stonehenge, as archaeologists at the time had envisioned it being fully constructed. Now it's not really accurate to how archaeologists view it now, but it was accurate to the time of a reconstructed Stonehenge. And you go down, and people, this Stonehenge of Washington is kind of an oddity. It's a tourist attraction. Many people in Washington don't know it exists. Most people in the country don't know it exists. But every so often, it crops up on lists of unusual monuments in the United States. You know, back in the day when there were cable TV shows like dedicated to travel, it would show up on travel TV shows, just as kind of a local oddity. But what most people don't realize is it's a World War One memorial. That's what it is. If you go down there and visit it, you can walk around it, and it has the names of people who perished in World War One from that region of Washington. And the reason that Sam Hill built it as a replica of Stonehenge is, at the time, archaeologists thought Stonehenge was a place of human sacrifice, where people went to sacrifice humans to their gods. We now know that, whether or not human sacrifice ever occurred at Stonehenge, there's an archaeological debate about that, but that's not it. And while it had a religious significance, it was primarily, it appears, a calendar, a solar calendar marking the summer and winter solstice. It was a calendar dedicated to time. It was not a place that was constructed for human sacrifice, regardless of whether or not human sacrifice ever took place there. It wasn't its purpose. But in the early 20th century, it was thought of as a place of human sacrifice. And Sam Hill thought that was an appropriate image of what World War I was. He saw World War I as a useless human sacrifice. That's just the kind of general mood of the country following this conflict. And so that zeitgeist and spirit that powered the progressive era is gone. And that means progressive reformers find very little traction in the 1920s. Organized labor finds itself under assault by big business with no assistance from the federal government. Civil rights groups find enormous setbacks. Not that civil rights groups ever gained any real traction during the progressive era, but they find open hostility after the war. You see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan resurges and expands all throughout the 1920s, and it moves during the 1920s. It moves out of the South and ends up all over the United States, including in Washington. And in fact, in Washington had lots of different Ku Klux Klan chapters here. And this Klan was not a secretive Klan. They didn't meet in secret. They wore their robes in public proudly, even with their masks off. They marched in parades. You can find images of the Ku Klux Klan marching in Wenatchee, Washington's Apple Blossom Parade. They were resurgent, expanding, and their racist, anti-Semitic ideology was considered publicly acceptable. It's horrifying to think about. It's horrifying to imagine, but there is this resurgence in racism and anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Semitism that happens in the country. We talked about that in the last lecture with a lot of the racial violence and with the immigration restrictions that we talked about in the last lecture. So, and Washington fully participates in these movements. Anti-immigrant hostility is incredibly strong in Washington. Racism is strong in Washington. Anti-Semitism is strong in Washington. In fact, Washington goes out of its way to marginalize um, uh, uh, immigrants and people of Asian heritage. So in 1921, Washington passes something known as the Alien Land Act. And what the Alien Land Act basically said is if you had no path to citizenship, if you could never become a U.S. citizen, then you were forbidden from owning land. You were forbidden from owning land. Well, the only group in this country that were denied a path to citizenship were immigrants from Asia. So, of course, if you were born in this country under the terms of the 14th Amendment, as endorsed by the Supreme Court in the Wong Kim Ark decision of 1898, by virtue of being born here on American soil, you are an American citizen. But if you are born outside the United States and immigrate here, then you must go through what's called the naturalization process. And in the 20th century, by law, people of Asian heritage were prevented from naturalizing as citizens. So their children, if born on this soil, would be American citizens, but they themselves would not. And the Anti-Alien Land Act was targeting immigrants and people of Asian heritage who were born outside the United States. They could live here, they could work here, but they could never own land. And this is in addition to the covenant system that we already talked about. So the same ideas, the same movements, the same things sweeping the country, Washington fully participates in. In terms of the economy, World War I was a boon to Washington's economy. We talked about that in a previous lecture. And when the war ends and all the demand for goods associated with the war ends, Washington's economy goes into economic decline. It goes into a recession, depression, depending on how you want to look at it. That is in line with most of the American economy in the immediate months and couple years after the war, because the American economy had been mobilized to support the war, and now that demand for those goods is gone, and consumer demand cannot keep up with it. However, what happens by 1921, 22, 23 is that overall the American economy begins to recover. So overall, the American economy begins to recover. Primarily that's because European countries stabilize. With the war over, European countries begin to rebuild and begin to stabilize after the war. That's good for American exports, particularly American factories who begin to send goods to Europe. America can produce cheaper and in larger quantities than most European countries. And so even when European factories recover from the war, they're undercut by American goods. And that as a whole, that light industry and heavy industry produced by factories causes the American economy as a whole to grow. The 1920s are known as a period of economic prosperity in American history. It's the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, where the economy was growing and there was tremendous wealth. Think about like the novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald, most famously The Great Gatsby, right? It's the quintessential Jazz Age novel describing wealthy elites back east. However, it's important to know that that economic growth in the 1920s was not evenly nor widely distributed in terms of social class or geography. That the economy was growing in industrial cities and in regions that supported those industrial cities, and therefore the economy was good. But in many places, particularly places in which there was a natural resource-based economy or an agricultural economy, the economy never recovered from the war. And Washington is one such place. While many other parts of the United States experience economic growth by the early 20s, Washington's economy never fully recovers. The natural resources and the agricultural industries never fully recover from the war, the decline of the war, And the shipbuilding industry, which was totally mobilized for the war, never recovers. So Washington's economy is not in a good place throughout the 1920s. What that means is when the Great Depression hits in Washington, times are already tough here and they're just going to get worse. So this is just a very short lecture to build upon the themes we talked about from the overall picture of the 1920s in the previous lecture. Washington is seeing economic growth during the war. That economic growth stops after the war, and unlike the rest of the country, it never fully recovers. The progressive spirit that had defined the region does not come back. So progressive reformers find little traction for their ideas, in particularly organized labor. Organized labor is also impacted by something we talked about a little bit earlier in a previous lecture, which is the Red Scare. This fear of communism. And this fear of communism and this anger at the war leads to a general resentment of all immigrants. Not that immigrants have been warmly received in the past, but there's a particular hostility to immigrants and immigration. And that is reflected in Washington as well. Racist movements begin to become more popularly acceptable in places like Washington. And laws are enshrined targeting particular non-white groups like people of Asian heritage. And so what we see in Washington is an exacerbation of some of the social and political trends in the country and an economy that never recovers from the war. All right. I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.